This week we are going to talk about the Great Depression. The Great Depression began in 1929 and it lasted most of the 1930s. So here we see an election map of the election of 1928. So leading up to this election, Americans were really pleased with the Republican Party. America had experienced a lot of economic prosperity during the 1920s. And so they thought if they elected another Republican president, that would kind of lead into the 1930s as well. So this is why we see Herbert Hoover earn so many votes during this election. But unfortunately for Hoover, shortly after he would be elected president, the stock market would crash in 1929. So this wasn't really all Herbert Hoover's fault. It's just how economics works. When you have a big era of economic prosperity, it kind of has to go down into some type of depression because that's just how the economy works. There are highs and there are lows. So unfortunately, it just happened to occur right after he became president. So the origins of the Great Depression. So the gap between the rich and the poor increased in the early 20th century. So we talked about this in previous weeks. And this is where we get the progressive era trying to make up for some of that inequality. So low corporate and personal taxes, easy credit, and depressed interest rates benefited wealthy investors. So when products failed to sell, inventories piled up, manufacturers scaled back production, companies fired workers, which stripped potential consumers of cash. It blunted the demand for consumer goods and replicated the downward economic cycle. So there's a lot of factors here that were hurting the economy. Overproduction of products, they couldn't sell them. Companies fired workers, so it means more unemployed, less flow of cash. So farm prices in the South and in the West continued their long decline because when there is too much of a good or too much of a product, prices tend to decrease. So prices plummeted as production climbed and domestic and international demand for cotton, foodstuffs, and other agricultural products stalled. So we kind of see that we have a surplus of goods. We're creating all of these products, but there's not enough demand for them. Okay, so another factor that we need to consider with the Great Depression is the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930.
Trade wars. They don't involve missiles, tanks, or guns, but they can cause a lot of damage. The United States learned this the hard way in the early 1930s with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Up until that time, the U.S. used tariffs, which are taxes on goods produced or grown abroad that are sold in the U.S., as a protectionist policy, or a policy aimed at shielding domestic industries from foreign competition. Tariffs increase the cost of foreign goods, making American goods relatively cheaper and therefore more attractive to customers. So when farmers in the U.S. started struggling financially in the late 1920s, their representatives in Congress tried to help them with tariffs. Senator Reed Smoot of Utah and Representative Willis Hawley of Oregon sponsored a tariff bill that was originally meant to only raise tariffs on foreign agricultural products, to specifically help American farmers. But as the bill moved through Congress, other lawmakers tried to help their constituents who worked in other industries, like manufacturing and mining. And by the time it passed through Congress, the bill was calling for 890 different tariffs to be raised on a huge variety of items, from clothespins to oil drums to bottle caps, raising tariffs by an estimated 20% on average. Opposition quickly formed. More than 1,000 American economists signed a petition urging President Herbert Hoover not to sign the bill. They claimed that raising so many tariffs so high would be a major mistake. They predicted that it would harm most Americans once other countries started retaliating with their own tariffs, which would make American products more expensive and thus less competitive in foreign markets. Hoover ignored their warning and signed the bill. International outrage was swift. Some countries, including Spain, Mexico, and Canada, struck back with increased tariffs on American goods. This hit American farmers hard because exports to Canada had been a major part of their business. For example, before the tariffs, the U.S. was selling nearly 12 million eggs to Canada per year. But after Smoot-Hawley, that number plummeted by almost 99%, down to 170,000. Other American industries were hurt too. U.S. automobiles, iron, and steel exports dropped by over 80%, eliminating hundreds of millions of dollars worth of sales. The U.S. wasn't just harmed economically, though. There were also major foreign policy consequences. For example, Smoot-Hawley's tariffs on imported sugar crushed the Cuban economy, which depended on sugar sales. Cuban anger over the tariffs helped revolutionaries overthrow their U.S.-friendly government, and they replaced it with one that sought more independence from the U.S. Another consequence was that countries responded to the U.S. tariffs with their own protectionist policies, against not just the U.S., but often everyone else as well. This reduced the total amount of international trade and deepened the Great Depression, which may have helped set the stage for World War II. But before that conflict began, Americans had changed their minds about tariffs. Franklin D. Roosevelt won the presidency in 1932, promising to lower tariffs as a way to fight the Great Depression. By 1934, Congress passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act, recognizing that tariffs shouldn't just be considered a domestic economic tool, but are also an important device for foreign policy and balancing international trade. With this bill, Congress gave the president authority to negotiate and lower tariffs with other countries. In the following decades, U.S. presidents from both parties used this authority to make international agreements that generally reduce tariffs, helping to build our modern global trade system. Almost all countries are now connected by trillions of dollars in exports and imports, supporting jobs and businesses around the world. So, the dangers posed by trade wars today have even greater potential for political destabilization and economic hardship on a global scale.
So these trade wars kind of helped to deepen the Depression and also decrease Hoover's public opinion and how much people liked him. Okay, so part of the problem and that caused this panic was that the Federal Reserve, so our national banking system, overcorrected in their response to speculation by raising interest rates and tightening credit. So people were already starting to panic, but the fact that the Federal Reserve System was raising interest rates didn't really help the situation. So banks were denying loans and people rushed to withdraw their money before institutions could close their doors. So this is what we see here with bank failures. We see people lining up, trying to make sure that they are able to withdraw the money that they have in these banks. So part of the problem, as we saw like with the origins of the Great Depression, was that there was mass unemployment. So people started to move trying to find jobs. So some states would put up signs like this saying that there were no jobs and that they shouldn't even really bother looking for work, that they didn't want these extra people there looking for work because there weren't even enough jobs to go around. Okay. And if there were any jobs, they would give them to people who were residents of California, not people who came from out of state. So Herbert Hoover and the politics of the Depression. So the public blame settled on President Herbert Hoover and the conservative politics of the Republican Party, which does make sense because if a situation like the Great Depression is going to happen, who do you look to blame first? It's going to be the president. So part of the issue was, though, that when suffering Americans looked to Hoover for help, Hoover could only answer with volunteerism, trying to tell them to go out, volunteer. Maybe that will help the economy get back on its feet. Also, another problem that Herbert Hoover had was when he would be interviewed about issues that were going on during the Great Depression, he would only answer questions that were written down for him beforehand and that he already knew how to answer. So when he was asked questions about the Great Depression that weren't written down for him beforehand and he just refused to answer them, it didn't really make him look that great. So he started the President's Organization for Unemployment Relief, also known as POOR. So POOR was created in 1931 by Herbert Hoover, and it was used to help citizens who lost their jobs. So he was trying to do a little bit, but he really didn't do as much as he could have. But to Hoover, direct government aid would discourage a healthy work ethic, and it would encourage associationalism would encourage the self-control and self-initiative that fueled economic growth. So the public was asking over and over again for Herbert Hoover to help them, but Hoover didn't really want to because he believed that if the government was helping them, that it would discourage them from trying to fix the problem themselves. Okay, so here we are going to look at Hoovervilles, which were makeshift houses that people created, and they named them Hoovervilles after Herbert Hoover. Okay, because once again, they blamed him for the Great Depression.
Today on the Daily Dose, Hoovervilles of the Great Depression. At the height of the Great Depression, when 1 in 4 eligible workers found themselves homeless and unemployed, hundreds of shantytown slums sprang up across the nation, housing hundreds of thousands of destitute Americans. Disillusioned citizens called them Hoovervilles, referring to the commonly held belief that Republican President Herbert Hoover was a do-nothing leader who passed responsibility for the rampant homeless epidemic onto local governments and charities. Homelessness was certainly present long before the Great Depression, making the condition a common sight in most American cities well before the Black Tuesday stock market crash of 1929. Most cities built municipal lodging houses for their homeless until the Great Depression exponentially increased demand for limited public housing. As a result, massive Hoovervilles formed around soup kitchens, usually trespassing on private lands, yet tolerated or ignored out of dire necessity. Some Hooverville residents possessed construction skills, allowing them to build their houses out of stone, but the vast majority resort. Today on the Daily Dose, usually trespassing on private lands, yet tolerated or ignored out of dire necessity. Some Hooverville residents possessed construction skills, allowing them to build their houses out of stone, but the vast majority resorted to building their residences out of wood from crates, cardboard, scraps of metal, or whatever materials they could find. When a Hooverville formed near the reservoir in New York Central Park, the residents were hastily evicted by the police. As the Depression wore on, however, public sentiment became more sympathetic, and in July 1931, a judge suspended the sentences of 22 unemployed men sleeping in Central Park, giving each of them $2 out of his own pocket. "We work hard to keep clean," one of the men said to the judge, "because that's important. I never lived like this before." In 1932, Democratic presidential candidate Franklin D. Roosevelt campaigned for the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid. After his election to the White House, at his direction, Congress passed a series of emergency measures known as the New Deal for the American people, forging a new government agency known as the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. The program would grow to employ 8.5 million people and spend over $11 billion as it transformed the nation's infrastructure by putting Americans back to work. And there you have it, Hoovervilles of the Great Depression. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose.
Okay, so then we have the bonus army. So 15,000 unemployed veterans and their families converged on Washington, D.C. to petition for a bill authorizing immediate payment of cash bonuses to veterans of World War I. So they weren't supposed to get these bonuses until the 1940s, until later, but because of the Great Depression, they wanted these bonuses now. So Hoover opposed the bill, and it was eventually voted down by the Senate. And General Douglas MacArthur, accompanied by local police, infantry, cavalry, tanks, and a machine gun squadron, stormed the tent city and routed the bonus army. So here is a video of the bonus army riots in Washington, D.C. So we're not going to watch the whole thing. I'll just skip to a few different parts so you can just have an idea of what was going on.
Police are entering the first of a score of old buildings appropriated by bonus seekers to clear them out. In many of the old buildings, which are about to be torn down, the eviction proceeded with little trouble. In some spots, the bonus seekers fortified themselves, too strongly placed for the police. 1,500 men of the regular army answered the president's call: cavalry, tanks, and infantry. The president declared that many of those remaining were communists or criminals, with few veterans among them. At the foot of Capitol Hill was burned to the ground. All shacks and tents were destroyed after the occupants had taken away their belongings. Some of the departing campers set the dwellings afire with their own hands, causing a pall of smoke to swirl upward toward the Capitol itself.
So now we're going to look at the impact that the Dust Bowl had on the Great Depression.
During the 1930s, a terrible drought struck Texas and the Great Plains. This one was different from any drought in the past. It triggered a decade-long series of dust storms that became known as the Dust Bowl. The causes of the Dust Bowl were both natural and man-made. Lack of rainfall made the ground that grew wheat, corn, and other valuable crops parched and cracked. Over-farming and outdated agricultural techniques eroded the once fertile topsoil and depleted the ground of its nutrients. In Texas, many dust storms were mild, but there were a few severe ones called black blizzards. Picture a snowstorm, but instead of fluffy snow falling from the sky, imagine dark, choking dust swirling all around.
The dust storms bring darkness at noon.
The worst of these black blizzards struck with a vengeance on April 14, 1935. It is often called Black Sunday by survivors, and the Texas Panhandle was the hardest hit area of the state. The storm carried the dust and topsoil so far that ships anchored 300 miles off the coast reported finding dust on their decks. Newspapers from across the country feverishly reported about Black Sunday, including Associated Press reporter Robert Geiger, who was credited with coining the phrase the Dust Bowl. As he wrote, three little words, achingly familiar on a Western farmer's tongue: rule life today in the Dust Bowl of the continent, if it rains. While Texas and the Great Plains faced the Dust Bowl, the rest of the country sank into the Great Depression following the stock market crash of 1929. With the livelihoods of most Texans tied to farming and living off the land, the prices for any and all crops dropped severely due to the Depression. Sonora Babb, a California journalist originally from Kansas, returned home to visit her mother and could not believe what had become of the plains and its downtrodden people. She reflected, "I saw them standing in line for the meat and potatoes of relief. Their stricken faces, one after another in the line, looked very much alike. As the soil that had once helped feed the nation turned to dust, many were forced to leave Texas in search of better farmland. Those who remained, however, received help from the federal government. The Civilian Conservation Corps was put in place to not only give people work, but also to try to conserve the soil and reverse the Dust Bowl. The CCC planted 200 million trees from Abilene, Texas, all the way to Canada. Another project called the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, employed millions of Texans on public projects. Most WPA jobs in Texas were in construction. Parks, swimming pools, bridges, highways were all built by hardworking Texans. Just as man-made and natural occurrences triggered the Dust Bowl, those same two forces helped end it. Rain began to fall more frequently, and the temperatures cooled. Farmers updated and changed their farming techniques to keep the topsoil healthy and fertile. The Dust Bowl taught Texans many important lessons about the land and how the health of it affects their society, economy, and community.
So moving on to some influential people that documented the Great Depression. We see Mary Lee. So she wrote this book called Quiet Odyssey, a pioneer Korean woman in America. And this was an important work during this time because it was really the first perspective that we see of America's first Korean pioneers. So Mary Lee was a Korean American writer, and this work was important because it showed us the struggle that Koreans faced in America. Okay, so watch a quick video on Dorothea Lange. So she is most famous for documenting the Great Depression. Specifically, she has a lot of good photographs of the Dust Bowl.
"1933, the depths of the Great Depression. Almost 25% of the American labor force, more than 13 million people, out of work. Dorothea Lange, a studio portrait photographer in San Francisco, was so moved by the jobless and homeless in local breadlines and soup kitchens that she began making street portraits, showing in stark black and white what the shortage of work and hope was doing to people who were too often and too easily unseen and overlooked. By the fall of 1935, Lange was working for the government's Farm Security Administration, documenting migrants from the Dust Bowl, masses of sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and their families traveling in wheezing, overpacked motor cars between work camps and shantytowns. I am trying here to say something about the dispirited, the defeated, the alienated, said Lange, about the wounded, the crippled, the helpless, the rootless. Lange had personal empathy for the physically disabled. She walked with a deep limp, the result of childhood polio, which Lange said was perhaps the most important thing that happened to me. It helped her see in the migrants, as she said, things that were more important than how poor they were: their pride, their strength, their spirit. No photograph shows that better than Migrant Mother, an iconic Lange photograph sometimes called the Mona Lisa of the Depression. Part of a sequence of shots Lang made in a California pea pickers camp in 1936, the image is a still photograph, yet deeply moving. The woman's face is layered with emotions: exhaustion, endurance, despair, dignity. Flashes of the human condition are in frame after frame of Lang's work: the value of family, of community, of a sense of home, and a sense of humor. Photography, said Lang, takes an instant out of time, altering life by holding it still. A photographer could alter a viewer's life in profound ways. You have the power to increase his perceptions and conceptions, said Lang. Lang tried to do that on a national scale in her work documenting the forced relocation of Japanese Americans to armed camps after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. She was deeply moved by the patience, the forbearance of the internees, more than 100,000 held at internment camps, many of them children. Lang's photos also stood as evidence of the poor conditions that many African Americans suffered at the time, due in part to racial discrimination and injustice. Despite long and frequent bouts with illness, Lang worked as a documentary photographer through the 1950s into the 1960s. She died in 1965 at the age of 70. She had tried, she said, for a visual life, an enormous undertaking, practically unattainable. I have only touched it, she said, just touched it. Today, Lang's photographs of the 1930s stand as dramatic records of the human costs of the Depression, as well as the dignity and the strength that helped Americans survive.
So the Great Depression in pop culture. So on the left is an example of a book that was written towards the end of the Great Depression, called The Grapes of Wrath, written by John Steinbeck. And this was a book about the Joad family who lost everything in the Dust Bowl. And so it documents kind of their trek to California in hope of finding more work. Although unfortunately, the father still struggles with finding work once he gets to California. So a pretty popular movie during this time was called Wild Boys of the Road. And this was a movie that came out in 1933, and it was a story of a couple of boys who, same situation kind of as Grapes of Wrath, where they were looking for work, so they decided to go somewhere else in hopes of finding a job. And so they are on their way to Chicago, and they find a girl who's also kind of in the same situation they are, and it just shows how these three people are kind of moving around, doing whatever they can in hopes of finding work. Okay, so we have the election of 1932. So because of kind of the negative attitudes of the public towards Herbert Hoover, we see this with the election results of 1932. So if you remember the election results of 1928, Herbert Hoover won a huge amount of votes. But we see this kind of flip on its side when we get to the 1932 election. So people are kind of over Herbert Hoover and the Republican Party, so they're looking for a change of pace. They're looking for someone new, and hopefully he will change what's going on in America at this point. So with the election of Herbert Hoover, we have Eleanor Roosevelt as our first lady. So FDR would be president for roughly 13 years, so Eleanor Roosevelt is our first lady who was in this position for the longest period of time. So Eleanor Roosevelt was born in 1884, and she was an American political figure, diplomat, and activist.
Eleanor Roosevelt had an active political career in her own right. She pushed the boundaries of what it meant to be a first lady.
Eleanor Roosevelt came from a New York aristocratic family. Her father was Teddy Roosevelt's brother. She meets Franklin Roosevelt. They get married in 1905. Franklin Roosevelt is her fifth cousin. She gave birth to 6 children. In 1918, she discovers her husband is having an affair. And that is when childbearing and marital intimacy come to an end.
She lived a separate life. He lived a separate life, but the relationship with her husband evolved where they were well and truly partners.
Eleanor Roosevelt really innovated the First Lady's role as a public communicator.
She wrote thousands of columns, 27 books. She participated in hundreds of radio shows.
When she came into the White House, one of the first things she did was to establish women-only press conferences. So all the reporters who covered her who came to the White House were female.
She would give them tidbits about White House life that the male press corps wasn't getting. It saved a lot of newspaper women's jobs.
During World War II, she traveled to the front lines in Europe and in the Pacific to support soldiers.
She met with servicemen in hospitals, took notes, and even contacted their families. There were some individuals that thought that she should stay at home and be the hostess and nothing else. That was not her.
Eleanor Roosevelt's biggest accomplishments were the public stances that she took, especially about civil rights. She went to Alabama for a conference. She requested a chair of her own, placed it squarely between the aisle for whites and the aisle for blacks. It was a very visible way to take a stand in opposition to the Jim Crow laws in the South.
The work that she did for equality continued after she was no longer First Lady.
Harry Truman appointed her as delegate to the United Nations, and she was absolutely instrumental in drafting the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which still informs human rights around the world today.
So another important woman throughout FDR's presidency was Mary Bethune. So she was an advisor to FDR. She was also an American educator, philanthropist, humanitarian, and a civil rights activist. So a third important woman throughout FDR's presidency was Frances Perkins. Frances Perkins is important because she was Secretary of Labor for the entirety of FDR's presidency from 1933 to 1945, and she was the first woman to serve in any cabinet position. So you can see this on the left that FDR is surrounded by advisors and cabinet members, and she is the only woman. Okay, so now we get to FDR's New Deal, which is probably what he's best known for.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to get a little bit controversial as we discuss the FDR administration's response to the Great Depression, the New Deal. That's the National Recovery Administration, by the way, not the National Rifle Association or the No Rodents Allowed Club, which I'm a card-carrying member of. Did the New Deal end the Depression? Spoiler alert. Yeah. More controversially, did it destroy American freedom or expand the definition of liberty? In the end, was it a good thing? Mr. Green. Yes. Me from the past, you are not qualified to make that statement.
What, I was just trying to be, provocative and controversial. Isn't that what gets views?
Oh, you have the worst ideas about how to make people like you. But anyway, not everything about the New Deal was controversial. This is Crash Course, not TMZ. The New Deal redefined the role of the federal government for most Americans, and it led to a realignment of the constituents in the Democratic Party, the so-called New Deal coalition. Good job with the naming there, historians. And regardless of whether you think the New Deal meant more freedom for more people or was a plot by red shirt wearing communists, the New Deal is extremely important in American history. Wait a second, I'm wearing a red shirt. What are you trying to say about me, Stan? As the owner of the means of production, I demand that you dock the wages of the writer who made that joke. So after his mediocre response to the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover did not have any chance of winning the presidential election of 1932, but he also ran like he didn't actually want the job. Plus, his opponent was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was as close to a born politician as the United States has ever seen, except for kid president. The phrase New Deal came from FDR's campaign, and when he was running, FDR suggested that it was the government's responsibility to guarantee every man a right to make a comfortable living, but he didn't say how he meant to accomplish this. Like it wasn't going to come from government spending, since FDR was calling for a balanced budget and criticizing Hoover for spending so much. Maybe it would somehow magically happen if we made alcohol legal again, and one thing FDR did call for was an end to prohibition, which was a campaign promise he kept. After 3 years of the Great Depression, many Americans seriously needed a drink, and the government sought tax revenue, so no more prohibition. FDR won 57% of the vote, and the Democrats took control of Congress for the first time in a decade. While FDR gets most of the credit, he didn't actually create the New Deal or put it into effect. It was passed by Congress. So WTF-DR was the New Deal? Basically, it was a set of government programs intended to fix the Depression and prevent future depressions. There are a couple of ways historians conceptualize it. One is to categorize the programs by their function. This is where we see the New Deal described as 3 R's. The relief programs gave help, usually money, to poor people in need. Recovery programs were intended to fix the economy in the short run and put people back to work. And lastly, the Run DMC program was designed to increase the sales of Adidas shoes. No, alas, it was reform programs that were designed to regulate the economy in the future to prevent future depressions. But some of the programs, like Social Security, don't fit easily into one category, and there are some blurred lines between recovery and reform. Like, how do you categorize the bank holiday and the Emergency Banking Act of March 1933, for example? FDR's order to close the banks temporarily also created the FDIC, which ensures individual deposits against future banking disasters. By the way, we still have all that stuff, but was it recovery because it helped the short-term economy by making more stable banks, or was it reform because federal deposit insurance prevents bank runs? A second way to think about the New Deal is to divide it into phases, which historians, with their A#1 naming creativity, call the first and second New Deals. This more chronological approach indicates that there has to be some kind of cause and effect thing going on, because otherwise, why would there be a second New Deal if the first one worked so perfectly? The first New Deal comprises Roosevelt's programs before 1935, many of which were passed in the first 100 days of his presidency. It turns out that when it comes to getting our notoriously gridlocked Congress to pass legislation, nothing motivates like crisis and fear. Stan, can I get the foreshadowing filter? We may see this again. So in a brief break from its trademark obstructionism, Congress passed laws establishing the Civilian Conservation Corps, which paid young people to build national parks, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Glass-Steagall Act, which barred commercial banks from buying and selling stocks, and the National Industrial Recovery Act, which established the National Recovery Administration, which has lightning bolts in its claws. The NRA was designed to be government planners and business leaders working together to coordinate industry standards for production, prices, and working conditions. But that whole public-private cooperation idea wasn't much immediate help to many of the starving unemployed, so the 100 Days reluctantly included the Federal Emergency Relief Administration to give welfare payments to people who were desperate. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. Roosevelt worried about people becoming dependent on relief handouts and preferred programs that created temporary jobs. One section of the NIRA created the Public Works Administration, which appropriated $33 billion to build stuff like the Triborough Bridge, so much for a balanced budget. The Civil Works Administration launched in November 1933 and eventually employed 4 million people building bridges, schools, and airports. Government intervention reached its highest point, however, in the Tennessee Valley Authority. This program built a series of dams in the Tennessee River Valley to control floods, prevent deforestation, and provide cheap electric power to people in rural counties in 7 southern states. But despite all that sweet, sweet electricity, the TVA was really controversial because it put the government in direct competition with private companies. Other than the NIRA, few acts were as contentious as the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The AAA basically gave the government the power to try to raise farm prices by setting production quotas and paying farmers to plant less food. This seemed ridiculous to the hungry Americans who watched as 6 million pigs were slaughtered and not made into bacon. Wait, Stan, 6 million pigs? But bacon is good for me. Only property-owning farmers actually saw the benefits of the AAA, so most African-American farmers who were tenants or sharecroppers continued to suffer. And the suffering was especially acute in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado, where drought created the Dust Bowl. All this direct government intervention in the economy was too much for the Supreme Court. In 1936, the court struck down the AAA in U.S. versus Butler. Earlier, in the Schechter poultry case, aka the sick chicken case, finally a Supreme Court case with an interesting name, the court invalidated the NIRA because its regulations, quote, delegated legislative powers to the president and attempted to regulate local businesses that did not engage in interstate commerce. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So with the Supreme Court invalidating acts left and right, it looked like the New Deal was about to unravel. FDR responded by proposing a law that would allow him to appoint new Supreme Court justices if sitting justices reached the age of 70 and failed to retire. Now, this was totally constitutional. You can go ahead and look at the Constitution if Nicolas Cage hasn't already swiped it, but it seemed like such a blatant power grab that Roosevelt's plan to, quote, pack the court brought on a huge backlash. Stop everything. I've just been informed that Nicolas Cage stole the Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution. I want to apologize to Nick Cage himself and also everyone involved in the National Treasure franchise, which is truly a national treasure. Anyway, in the end, the Supreme Court began upholding the New Deal laws, starting a new era of Supreme Court jurisprudence in which the government regulation of the economy was allowed under a very broad reading of the Commerce Clause. Because really, isn't all commerce interstate commerce? I mean, if I go to Jimmy John's, don't I exit the state of hungry and enter the state of satisfied? Thus began the second New Deal, shifting focus away from recovery and toward economic security. Two laws stand out for their far-reaching effects here: the National Labor Relations Act, also called the Wagner Act, and the Social Security Act. The Wagner Act guaranteed workers the right to unionize, and it created a National Labor Relations Board to hear disputes over unfair labor practices. In 1934 alone, there were more than 2,000 strikes, including one that involved 400,000 textile workers. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? Man, I wish there were a union to prevent me from getting electrocuted. The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document, and I'm usually wrong and get shocked. Refusing to allow people to be paid less than a living wage preserves to us our own market. There is absolutely no use in producing anything if you gradually reduce the number of people able to buy even the cheapest products. The only way to preserve our markets is an adequate wage. Oh, I mean, you usually don't make it this easy, but I'm gonna guess that it's Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Dang it! Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor, of course it was Eleanor. Ah! The most important union during the 1930s was the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which set out to unionize entire industries like steel manufacturing and automobile workers. In 1936, the United Auto Workers launched a new tactic called the sit-down strike. Workers at the Fisher Body plant in Flint, Michigan simply stopped working, sat down, and occupied the plant. Eventually, GM agreed to negotiate, and the UAW won. Union membership rose to 9 million people as, quote, CIO unions helped to stabilize a chaotic employment situation and offered members a sense of dignity and freedom. That quote, by the way, is from our old buddy Eric Foner. God, I love you, Foner. And unions played an important role in shaping the ideology of the Second New Deal because they insisted that the economic downturn had been caused by underconsumption and that the best way to combat the Depression was to raise workers' wages so that they could buy lots of stuff. The thinking went that if people experienced less economic insecurity, they would spend more of their money, so there were widespread calls for public housing and universal health insurance. And that brings us to the crowning achievement of the Second New Deal and/or the crowning achievement of its communist plot, the Social Security Act of 1935. Social Security included unemployment insurance, aid to the disabled, aid to poor families with children, and of course, retirement benefits. It was and is funded through payroll taxes rather than general tax revenue, and while state and local governments retained a lot of discretion over how benefits would be distributed, Social Security still represented a transformation in the relationship between the federal government and American citizens. Like before the New Deal, most Americans didn't expect the government to help them in times of economic distress. After the New Deal, the question was no longer if the government should intervene, but how it should. For a while, the U.S. government under FDR embraced Keynesian economics, the idea that the government should spend money even if it means going into deficits in order to prop up demand. And this meant that the state was much more present in people's lives. I mean, for some people, that meant relief or Social Security checks. For others, it meant a job with the most successful government employment program, the Works Progress Administration. The WPA didn't just build post offices, it paid painters to make them beautiful with murals. It paid actors and writers to put together plays and ultimately employed more than 3 million Americans each year until it ended in 1943. It also, by the way, paid for lots of photographers to take amazing photographs, which we can show you for free because they are owned by the government. So I'm just gonna keep talking about how great they are. Oh, look at that one. That's a winner. Okay, equally transformative, if less visually stimulating, was the change that the New Deal brought to American politics. The popularity of FDR and his programs brought together urban progressives who would have been Republicans 2 decades earlier with unionized workers, often immigrants, left-wing intellectuals, urban Catholics, and Jews. FDR also gained the support of middle-class homeowners, and he brought African Americans into the Democratic Party. Who was left to be a Republican, Stan? I guess there weren't many, which is why FDR kept getting reelected until, he died. But fascinatingly, one of the biggest and politically most important blocs in the New Deal coalition was white Southerners, many of whom were extremely racist. Democrats had dominated in the South since the end of Reconstruction, since the other party was the party of Lincoln. And all those Southern Democrats who'd been in Congress for so long became important legislative leaders. In fact, without them, FDR never could have passed the New Deal laws, but Southerners expected whites to dominate the government and the economy, and they insisted on local administration of many New Deal programs. And that ensured that the AAA and the NLRA would exclude sharecroppers and tenant farmers and domestic servants, all of whom were disproportionately African American. So did the New Deal end the Depression? No. By 1940, over 15% of the American workforce remained unemployed. But then again, when FDR took office in 1933, the unemployment rate was at 25%. Maybe the best evidence that government spending was working is that when FDR reduced government subsidies to farms and the WPA in 1937, unemployment immediately jumped back up to almost 20%. And many economic historians believe that it's inaccurate to say that government spending failed to end the Depression because in the end, at least according to a lot of economists, what brought the Depression to an end was a massive government spending program called World War II. So given that, is the New Deal really that important? Yes. Because first, it changed the shape of the American Democratic Party. African Americans and union workers became reliable Democratic votes. And secondly, it changed our way of thinking. Like liberalism in the 19th century meant limited government and free market economics. Roosevelt used the term to refer to a large, active state that saw liberty as, quote, greater security for the average man. And that idea that liberty is more closely linked to security than it is to, freedom from government intervention is still really important in the way we think about liberty today. No matter where they fall on the contemporary political spectrum, politicians are constantly talking about keeping Americans safe. Also, our tendency to associate the New Deal with FDR himself points to what Arthur Schlesinger called the imperial presidency. That is, we tend to associate all government policy with the president. Like after Jackson and Lincoln's presidencies, Congress reasserted itself as the most important branch of the government. But that didn't happen after FDR. But above all that, the New Deal changed the expectations that Americans had of their government. Now, when things go sour, we expect the government to do something. We'll give our last words today to Eric Foner, who never phoners it in. The New Deal, quote, made the government an institution directly experienced in Americans' daily lives and directly concerned with their welfare. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is made with the help of all of these nice people, and it is possible.
So that was just an overview of the New Deal. I will go over a little bit about the difference between the first New Deal and the second New Deal. But hopefully that allowed you to have or provided some imagery so you can better understand the New Deal programs. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the first New Deal. So I'm just going to briefly go over 4 different programs that were established during the first New Deal. They were talked about in the video, but I'm still going to go over them just pretty briefly. So the Emergency Banking Act of 1933, this gave the president emergency powers over the U.S. banking system, under which he called it a banking holiday, to allow evaluation of all banks and closure of insolvent ones. So essentially just giving the president a lot more powers over the banking system. Second one is Glass-Steagall Banking Act. So this created Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to insure personal bank accounts. So it separated commercial from investment banking. The Civilian Conservation Corps generally referred to as the CCC. So with a lot of New Deal programs, they're normally referred to by their acronym. But this was created under Emergency Conservation Act, and this put unemployed, unskilled young men to work on rural and park improvements. Then we have the Tennessee Valley Authority, also known as TVA, and this is generally one of the more well-known aspects of the New Deal. So the TVA was created under the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, and it planned river basin development based on dams and hydroelectricity, specifically in the Tennessee Valley. Okay. So also with Franklin Roosevelt and his first New Deal, we have the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which went into effect in 1933, but it was reauthorized in 1938. So Agricultural Adjustment Administration, also known as AAA, was created for price stabilization and income support through government purchases, marketing boards, and land retirement. So really just focusing on getting prices back to where they should be based on things that were agriculturally created. So National Industrial Recovery Act went into effect in 1933, and this ensured the right of workers to organize and provided a national minimum wage and outlawed child labor. So this was a huge step in getting good working conditions for Americans. Okay, and then the next one is the Public Works Administration. So the Public Works Administration is generally known as, once again, by its acronym PWA. And the Public Works Administration was part of the New Deal, once again, 1933. And it was part of this large-scale public works construction agency in order to provide new jobs for Americans. So this is when we see the building of dams, building of bridges, things like that. Okay, so there were some voices of protest during this time by Huey Long, who's on the left, and Francis Townsend, who is on the right. And generally, they were skeptical of FDR because they wanted him to do more. They thought the government should be doing more to help out Americans. So Huey Long was an American politician, and he was a proponent or a fan of Share Our Wealth, which is essentially taking money away from those who are wealthier and giving it to people who are poor or less fortunate. Townsend was a former doctor from California, and he was mostly concerned with the elderly. So he came up with a plan to provide economic security for the elderly, and he also thought that economic recovery could be encouraged by allowing elderly workers to retire, and by allowing these workers to retire, it would create more jobs in the workforce for younger people who were entering the workforce. Okay, so the second New Deal is generally categorized as 1935 to 1936. The first one is the Works Progress Administration. So the Work Progress Administration was an American New Deal agency, and its whole goal was to employ millions of job seekers to carry out public works projects. So very similar to the one we just looked at. So this includes the construction of public buildings and roads. So the next one, the National Labor Relations Act. This was passed in 1935. Also known as the Wagner Act, and this reaffirmed the right of collective bargaining with rules and enforcement by a National Labor Relations Board. So So essentially with the national labor, they offered federal legal protection for the first time for workers to form unions. And then lastly, the Social Security Act. This provided unemployment insurance and economic aid to assist the elderly and dependent children. Okay, so the end of the New Deal, there's been some debate about when the New Deal actually ended, but it's generally considered to be from 1937 to 1939. So conservative barriers continue to limit the power of his popular support, of Roosevelt's popular support. So during this time, we have a Democrat in office. Democrats are in control of Congress, of both houses, of the House of Representatives and the Senate. The only branch that FDR does not really have control over is the Supreme Court. So he comes up with this idea to pack the Supreme Court because they keep looking at his New Deal plans as unconstitutional. So his solution to that is to pack the Supreme Court. So he tries to create a new position for every Supreme Court justice who is over 70. So at that time, 6 of the Supreme Court justices were over 70. So that would have created 6 new positions within the Supreme Court. People were not happy about this. They kind of saw what Roosevelt was trying to do. He was kind of looking for a loophole to try to gain control of the Supreme Court. But his packing of the Supreme Court did not work out, and we still only have 9 justices on the Supreme Court. So the Roosevelt recession of 1937, he decided to cut spending, which put the United States in an economic recession, very similar to what was happening in 1932 to 1933. So because of this recession, Americans blamed it on Roosevelt, and as a result, it hurt Democrats in the 1938 midterms, and Roosevelt struggled to build congressional support for new reforms because people were not liking Roosevelt that much at this time. But soon afterwards, American focus kind of gets put towards World War II, and people kind of forget about what's going on with Roosevelt, and he actually ends up getting reelected shortly after this, before World War I, or for America's involvement. So the legacy of the New Deal. So by the end of the 1930s, Roosevelt and his Democratic Congresses had presided over a transformation of the American government. Before the New Deal, there wasn't really much involvement from the government in helping out economically with the American people. So we see that this huge shift of Americans starting to depend on the government for economic help. So after the New Deal, Americans came to see the federal government as a potential ally in their daily struggles, whether that be through finding work, securing a decent wage, getting a fair price for agricultural products, or organizing a union. So with the New Deal, we kind of see Americans start to kind of trust the federal government a little bit more and start to be okay with how much power they have over the economy. Okay, so that's it for the Great Depression, and then next week we will look at World War II.